Hello and welcome to the Blavatnik School of Government here at the University of Oxford. My name is Tobias Kremer. I'm a junior research fellow in the Religion and Frontier Challenges program at Pembroke College here at Oxford. And I'm welcoming you this evening in the name of the Alfred Landecker program, one of the Blavatnik School's research programs on the rights of minorities and other vulnerable people, as well as in the name of the Protestant Political Thought Project, a non-sectarian, non-partisan, cross-Atlantic network which seeks to facilitate conversations between scholars and religious communities about issues such as nationalism and populism. And before we dive in, just a very quick note that this webinar is coupled with another one that took place yesterday, and that was titled Racism, Islamophobia, and Anti-Semitism. If you have been there, perfect. If not, you've missed out, but fret not. The recording is now available on YouTube, as will be the case for this conversation today, which will be recorded and then posted. And these webinars come in fact in place of a conference which our team has decided to postpone until April 2022 due to the circumstances of the pandemic. But in the meantime, we have three special issues in the making: one with religion, state, and society, one with the Journal of the Bible and its Reception, and one with the International Journal of Religion. So please keep your eyes open for these special issues as they come out. Today's seminar is titled Seeking the Common Good, the Role of Churches in a Post-Secular and Post-Christendom Context. And I'm really delighted to welcome three fantastic panelists for this conversation. First, Anne Guillard from the University of Geneva and SciencesPo Paris, then Sophia Johnson from the University of Cambridge, and our very own Marietta von der Tol here from the Blavatnik School of Government. Anne will start the conversation by giving us a bit of an insight into some of her doctoral research at Geneva and SciencesPo. In her thesis, she explores the possibility of a public theology shaped by pragmatist philosophy within a liberal regime. And today she'll talk in particular about her research on how Christianity can constructively and humbly contribute to the common good when Christianity is one among many voices, and how such a vision of the common good contrasts with identitarian uses of Christianity, for instance, by right-wing populist movements. Our first respondent to Anne's presentation will then be Sophia Johnson. Sophia is a PhD candidate at the Divinity Faculty of the University of Cambridge, specializing in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. She chairs the part of the Protestant Political Thought Project that is housed in the Cambridge Center for Geopolitics, where she leads a reading group on race, biblical interpretation, and global perspectives of political theology. And Sophia's response will reflect on her research in the reception history of biblical covenant in Christian political thought and its application in contemporary communities. And then finally, Marietta will round up the conversation, offering a response based on her research on the visibility of religious diversity in public space. Marietta is a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Blavatnik School with the Alfred Landecker program and oversees the Protestant Political Thought Project. And it is largely thanks to her, really, that we are all here today, as she has done most of the organizing work. So a big thank you to you, Marietta, for this. And as you can imagine, there's an awful lot to discuss on these topics, so I don't want to keep you much longer. Just a very quick word on housekeeping before we start. So as we go through the different presentations, please feel free to start formulating your questions and voting for others in the chat. And we will most likely have to make a selection of these during the Q&A, as chances are that otherwise we'll be sitting here until midnight and you'd all miss out on your newly won freedom to spend an evening in a pub if you're in the UK, and we certainly don't want to do that. But this webinar is really just part of the beginning of a much longer conversation with the Alfred Landecker program. So if you would like to be part of these ongoing conversations, please do get in touch via email. But now, without any further ado, Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tobias. And thank you, Marietta, for welcoming me. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. So I would like to discuss here is how Christian religious private experience can contribute to the common public good and stand up against Christians' appeal to populist currents. So in 1907, when the Pope Pius X condemned in his encyclical Pascendi the errors of modernism, a catch-all word for a number of thinkers who, in the eyes of Rome, were hearers of Kant and argued with modernity, which was, according to the Pope, the synthesis of all heresies. What motivated his gesture was a fear of seeing this authority of traditional theology being supplanted by forms of cultural relativism. More than a century later, this fear of secular modernity has become a pattern within the Roman Catholic Church and is also found in Protestant evangelical currents. Looking at the sociological and political evolution of the last 10 years, it seems indeed that Christians in Europe, as well as those in the United States, seem to understand the faith more as a bulwark against the torments of the world. So we will take the case of Christians in France to observe these mutations which manifest their desire to be present and to enjoy an increased recognition in the public space. To counter the effects of this secularization and of the heresies produced by the liberal values of modernity, this Christian activism reaffirms the relevance of Christianity in politics and envisages issues that engage the entire society with a naivety that is not without danger. So our question is therefore the following. If for many good reasons, the disintegration of the social ties generated by striking economic inequalities and the massive degradation of ecosystems, the world before us seems quite inhospitable, how can we commit ourselves to building a political future that is neither conditioned nor hindered by the fear of decline, relayed today by a large fringe of intellectuals and among them Christians? In order to understand that is at stake in this issue, I will begin by giving a sociological and political overview of this phenomenon of Christian repoliticization in France. In particular, I will show that this commitment, because it is driven by fear and distrust of the values of liberal democracy, is dangerously close to populist currents. In a second step, I will analyze the type of political theology that seems to be mobilized. I say seems to be because it is not explicitly claimed as such, to explain these religious commitments in politics. I will show the ambivalence of this political theology, which hesitates between withdrawing from the shared world in order to live in a homogeneous community, and the hegemonic desire to find an identity between the political community and the Christian community, as was the case during Christianity. In a third step, I will show that this alternative is neither politically nor theologically satisfactory. I will then propose another political theology that would be able to think about the responsibility of Christian faith in liberal democracy and its resources to contribute to a vision of the common. Thus, my proposal is guided by a normative conception of the role that Christian religious communities can play in public life. It is not a question of criticizing the participation of Christians in public debate, but of reflecting on their modalities. It is essential to be clear about the dangers of the political participation of religion in order to be able to enter the public arena constructively and to benefit wisely from its power of social transformation. So let's begin with the first step. Over the last 10 years or so, France has witnessed a shift from what the sociologist Daniel Hervieux-Léger called a Christianity of belonging to a Christianity of militancy. This transition is made manifest by the development of a counter-cultural posture within the Christian sphere, i.e. a contesting cultural movement that deliberately sets itself apart from the dominant culture and fights against the latter. This manifests itself in speeches or the creation of political movements that convey a distrust of modernity and aim to wage a moral crusade against societal developments related to the cultural and legislative promotion of gender and sexual equality. This is particularly the case in what sociologists in France call identity Catholicism. This is a minority, but a vocal one, that struggles for hegemony inside and outside the church to counter the social and ecclesial effects of the anthropological changes brought by modernity. A Christianity of objection, openly countercultural, seems to have the wind in its sails in France, giving a new version to a centuries-old tradition of mistrust of modernity. It is actively carried by a constellation of Catholic personalities who are united in their severe judgment of the political and philosophical heritage of the Enlightenment, which through its relativism, egalitarianism, and individualistic conception of autonomy seems to them to threaten the thousand-year-old anthropological heritage of Christianity. They are journalists, priests, bloggers, directors of private educational institutes, presidents of associations, elected officials, or founders of magazines or political movements. They seem obsessed with decadence and are committed to seeking in their religion a reassuring and orderly vision of life. This involves a reaffirmation of patriarchy and of a fighting spirituality. This short extract from a text by Fabrice Adjadj, director of a Christian training institute called Philanthropos, is quite typical in this respect. So what is our republic in its effective reality apart from the empire of consumption? They talk about values, but apart from the values of the market, I see only emptiness. For France to remain, it must rediscover its memory and its history, and therefore its Catholic fabric. It is up to the faithful to practice a strong evangelization. Let them stop being soft figures. Too often they have been reduced to humanitarians and social workers. This effeminacy of the Christian religion goes hand in hand with the loss of the sense of apostolate. So despite appearances, this type of discourse seems to us to be paradigmatic of a defensive posture, since it places a maximum tension between the strong evangelization that the faithful should practice and the vacuity of the values of the secular world. But this suspicion of modernity is coupled with a desire for a moral crusade that is particularly problematic when it enters the political arena. With the opening of the debates on the law on marriage for all, the identity pole of Christianity has found in the struggle against gay marriage an opportunity to enter the public debate by entering the main parties on the right of the political spectrum, and by creating in 2013 the so-called Sens commun movement within the Republicans. By gathering hundreds of thousands of people in the streets in the spring of 2013, the Manif pour tous, so in French it means demonstration for all against marriage for all law, structured in 37 associations, quickly constituted the founding moment of a new generation of Catholics in politics. Remobilized in the ranks of the Manif pour tous, they found a new capacity to shape the public debate by accentuating in the media sphere the image of a Catholicism of intransigence and identity. They transformed the trial into a new political force capable of integrating the political game in order to put societal issues at the heart of the debate. This has created the conditions for greater porosity between conservative Catholic circles and identity-based networks. By joining the demonstrations and relaying them on the internet, notable figures from the far right or ultra-conservative Catholicism have encouraged the development of a victimhood posture, contributing to the spread of a discourse of suspicion among supporters. This type of discourse fits the ambitions of political groups that politically reappropriate Christian values in order to defend political programs that tend to be on the extreme right of the political spectrum. Indeed, the dam that separated practicing Catholics from the Front National, or now called Rassemblement National, vote cracked. Till then, the Catholics as a traditional right-wing electorate were known as being the sanitary cordon, preventing the far right to access to power. So in 2015, by choosing to invite Marion Maréchal Le Pen, the niece of Marine Le Pen, to a summer university for young Catholics who wished to combine political commitment and religious faith through the social doctrine of the Church, Monseigneur Dominique Ray, Bishop of Toulon-Fréjus, and the Dominican order made a decision with ambiguous consequences. While it allowed to acknowledge a new reality, the far right's appeal, this gesture above all contributed to trivializing it. Thus, 2 years later, in April 2017, the weekly magazine Famille Chrétienne, which is widely read in practicing Catholic circles, did not hesitate to publish an interview with the headline, Marion Maréchal Le Pen, Emmanuel Macron is a civilizational danger, during the presidential campaign, giving a blank check to the niece of the National Front candidate without showing any critical, historical, or media distance from the risk that her candidacy actually represented. Let's say that in general, the Christian media, and particularly the Catholic media in France, have given a wide coverage to these politicians during the campaign, as you can see on the pictures. So Marion Maréchal Le Pen's discourse mixes economic neoliberalism with an anti-libertarian stance on societal issues that appeals to the most rigorous Catholics, just as the reservations expressed by the bishops about the far-right party over the past few years have become less and less clear. The theologian Christian de la Haye denounced in an article in Le Monde entitled "Shame on the Bishops Who Do Not Call for a Vote Against Marine Le Pen," the lack of clarity in the position of the French bishops on the evening of the first round of the 2017 presidential election, recalling the strong words they had found in 2002 to criticize the candidate Jean-Marie Le Pen. So it is therefore a broader and deeper recomposition that concerns us. It shows the emergence of a radical right wing that unabashedly relies on the Christian religion and representatives as a basis for its moral authority. But I find it interesting to ask what kind of political theology these new religious commitments in public life are based on, consciously or not. So political theology, to put it briefly, is a field of reflection that examines the relationship between the churches and political power, and more specifically, the influence that the churches can have on public life. In our case, we can see that these engagements are oscillating between two poles. One pole is a distinction between secular worldliness and faith, whereas the other pole refers to the imperative of deprivatizing faith. So I have identified that this oscillation manifests itself in the use of two types of rhetoric: a polemical denunciation of modernity and a claimed apologetic. If we look closely at the repoliticization of Christianity and its instrumentalization, we can see that this mistrust, which we described earlier, is part of a type of political theology that can be described as appellative, according to the categories proposed by the German jurist Böckenförde. The appellative type consists in underlining the ambivalent status of the Church between its worldly presence and its eschatological reserve. This discourse strives to justify the relevance of faith to politics. It is often a political theology of protest based on an ethics of conviction. The countercultural and often provocative posture through the sharp criticism of feminism and gender studies, for example, that we have seen, suggests that the Christian heritage is the surest bulwark against the generalized collapse of values. This type of thinking is found in a more elaborate way in contemporary theologies, such as Milbank's or Hauerwas. The theme of resistance dominates their writings. Their idea is to think of a political theology that provides a kind of Christian counterculture framed by social and ritual practices of agape and nourished by biblical narratives and imagination. It is, in Milbank's terms, a counter-ethic based on a counter-ontology and within the framework of a counter-kingdom. So in this perspective of political theology, the church and faith are again seen as powers of resistance with prophetic overtones to the perils of modernity. It seems that polemical denunciation is coupled with a rhetoric of preservation of the Christian heritage, or alternatively of Christian roots, to counter the corrosive effects of secularization. The promotion of Christian values taken up and manipulated by populist parties is a particular example. Internally, identity Christianity uses marketing technique for proselytizing purposes, inspired by evangelization practices from across the Atlantic. This can be illustrated by the setting up of masculinist Christian camps by various Christian communities, such as la Communauté des Béatitudes, or la Communauté de l'Emmanuel, or la Communauté du Chemin Neuf, which are inspired by the pastoral proposals of John Eldredge in his book While at Heart. They form then fraternities spread out in France, Belgium, and Switzerland. So you can see on the map. We also see this when the Bishop Ray, we already talked about him, engages in the creation of a French translation of the Knightly Order of the Knights of Columbus with the help of Arnaud Boutéon, who is a communicator of La Manif pour tous and the co-founder of the movement Sens Commun, I already talked about. So one senses a dynamic of ecclesial entrepreneurship in order to lead the moral crusade. These attempts are therefore part of protest political theologies based solely on an ethics of conviction that is not articulated with an ethics of responsibility, to use the Weberian categories. They present themselves as critical bodies without being able to propose an alternative other than that of imposing their comprehensive doctrine on the whole of society. It would seem that these movements cannot bear to see themselves as a minority and to play the game of the conditions of participation in the debate of liberal democracy. The adoption of this type of posture shows that these personalities and movements spare themselves to enter the perilous exercise of making their certainties vulnerable. Consequently, despite their willingness to enter the political game, they do not meet the prerequisites of public discussion, in particular the requirement of viability proper to political discussion in a liberal democracy. The justification of the deprivatization of faith as a means to criticize the historical present is the common ground of these two types of rhetoric. But it is clear that a theology that wants to be properly public cannot stop there. It must contribute to public life in the frame of a liberal democratic state. So how then can we ensure that a public theology is not limited to a Christian critical resistance? Or worse, in our case, how can we ensure that Christian commitment is not instrumentalized in populist causes? To answer this question, I propose another way of perceiving the public commitment of the religious from his or her private experience. But in order to think this way, it is necessary, first of all, that this proposal be based on a different type of political theology than the one I have shown above. A political theology of vulnerability. I argue in my work that the political framework provided by liberal democracy allows public theology to think of itself as participating in political pluralism from its own private experiences. So let us return to our question. How can we ensure that a public theology is not limited to an ethic of commitment or to a critical and counter-cultural resistance, but that it can contribute concretely to the common good? In my view, overcoming this limitation and consequently the renewal of purely heterogeneous relations between the political and the theological implies, first of all, sharing the same language and the fundamental epistemic values of liberal thought. So what are these epistemic values? Relativism, pluralism, and fallibilism. Relativism refers to the recognition that all knowledge and practice is inseparable from a point of view. It implies the requirement for interlocutors to make their position and beliefs explicit. Pluralism refers to the equal and mutual respect of all participants and their freedom of expression. And fallibilism refers to exposing oneself to the refutation of counter-experiments and counter-arguments. Therefore, the truth claim of a position can never be set up as an absolute. So these three liberal values sketch out an epistemological charter of public theology that draws another way of shaping a public engagement of the religious. It is therefore to this epistemic condition that a political theology that claims to contribute to the common must respond, because it is on this condition that public discussion is possible. A theology of vulnerability embraces these epistemic values and postulates that it is in the seams of this world that God, if he exists, can give himself and not in the counter-kingdom. It consists in betting that the experience of faith will grow if it dares to listen to the deep aspirations that continue to find their expression in the cultural forms of our time, which refer much less to God than in the past. I have called this public theology as political theology of vulnerability in reference to theologian John Caputo's idea of God's weakness. It is about conceiving of God's existence as a possibility rather than a certainty, and as a gift that is free and not owed, welcomed or ignored, rather than something that must be defended. It is a question of dispossessing oneself of the little temporal power that religion still holds, in this case, the power that is exercised over the bodily conduct of its faithful, in order to trust more in the capacities of discernment of each individual. However, vulnerability is not fragility. What this kind of theology would allow is a firm refusal of dogmatism of thought, whether religious or political. In so doing, this type of theology would not allow itself to be rearmed in the dogmatic programs of populist political streams. The life of faith, the experience of the spiritual life, developed the essential attitudes to stop the spiral of mistrust and shape an ethics of belief in public engagement. So the experience of the spiritual life develops attitudes, nourishes faculties that are essential to this type of political theology and are fortiori to engage in the game of liberal public reason. So I have thus identified 6 attitudes: the priority of listening and the a priori of benevolence, commanded by an evangelical concern for understanding the world that precedes any critical judgment. We have a clear definition of this attitude in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. So let it be presupposed that every good Christian is to be more ready to save his neighbor's proposition than to condemn it. If he cannot save it, let him inquire how he means it. And if he means it badly, let him correct him with charity. If that is not enough, let him seek all the suitable means to bring him to mean it well and save himself. The second attitude is the ability to recognize the power of self-transformation that is proper to the life of faith. It is a theology that prevents any risk of making the Christian religion an identity that would freeze our self-understanding. The third one is the yearning for freedom. As Christians, we believe that God's promise to the people of Israel to free them from their yoke found its definitive fulfillment in Christ and was then reiterated again and again by the witness of men and women who followed him. However, since the beginning of modernity, this aspiration to freedom has largely been perpetuated outside the instituted forms of religion and even against it, taking the form of a quest for emancipation, most often devoid of any reference to God. This theology should look at this aspiration to freedom and the secular places where it continues to be expressed. The fourth one is the sense of responsibility in conveying discourses and taking action that, rather than undermining social trust, build it. According to theologian Kathleen Kavanaugh, one of the main differences between a populist discourse and a prophetic discourse is the ability to draw a horizon of hope and trust common to all, regardless of people's affiliation, beliefs, and origins. The fifth one is the practical cooperation with non-believers and other believers. It means to nurture a desirable common future and to join forces with people who share a set of values that enable cooperation. In his 1963 encyclical Pacem in Terris, Pope John XXIII was the first pope to call on Christians to work together with people of goodwill who do not necessarily share the Christian faith. This importance of practical collaboration with non-believers and other believers was clearly recalled by Pope Francis in the encyclical Laudato Si in 2015. And the last attitude is the capacity for spiritual and prudential discernment. Religious experience has recorded in its tradition a particular competence, the discernment of experience. This skill is particularly useful for identifying the values arising in our collective experiences that we want to cherish and defend by their institutionalization. These values then guide our collective decisions. So to conclude, I believe these attitudes and competencies allow to conceive the private experience of religion as an ethical source of contribution to the common good, which also nourishes the fundamental values of the social contract. So in this way, a culture of trust can be built so that, as the psalm says, love and truth meet, justice and peace embrace. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for starting our conversation with such an engaging presentation. I want to, in my response, pick up on some of the issues that you touched on about othering, which in my own study of biblical reception history in Christian political thought, I have found to be one of the most, if not the most consistent problem, especially in terms of church public engagement. As Tobias mentioned in his introduction, my primary area of research is in the concept of covenant, which in and of itself is a term fraught with theological and political baggage, but it can basically be understood as a compact or a treaty, usually associated with a religious or moral higher power. Covenant has dominated much of Christian political thought, especially since the Reformation, particularly in the formation of the idea of constitution as many scholars such as Daniel J. Elazar and G.H. Dodge have documented thoroughly. However, as a biblical scholar, I have found the move to equate covenant with constitution in many ways anachronistic and problematic in its own right, especially concerning issues of national identity, some of which Anne herself touched on. I can go into that in more detail later if it's appropriate to our discussion, but I wanted to focus my response on giving a positive contribution. While it may be questionable at a national level, I believe thinking of local communities as bound by a covenant in a move to sort of re-theologize and maybe add some corrections to the social contract theory post-Locke and Rousseau, I think it does offer some suggestions, especially in overcoming Christian isolationism, which Anne so beautifully outlined some examples of. In its earliest biblical form, covenant was merely a contract or an agreement that could either bring people together or could delineate between groups. For example, the covenant between Jacob and Laban in Genesis 31 verses 43 to 55 draws boundaries between the lands of these two patriarchs and between the peoples that they represent, between the Israelites and the Arameans, ensuring that they never intermix or intermarry. Unfortunately, this kind of negative, we might say, delineative function of covenant is often the function that's traditionally been worked into many visions of politics. But as the Hebrew Bible developed over time, especially under the influence of some of the other cultures around it, I would say in particular the treaty tradition of the Assyrian Empire, covenant became more of a bonding agent. It drew the diverse Israelite people spread across the nations in exile around a common object, and it held them responsible for each other under God. This is how the account of the Mosaic covenant, as we have it in our scriptures now, came to be shaped as an agreement between God and the people associated with the law or the Torah. While there are still some issues with this model, especially with the kind of us-them self-identification, the vision of covenant provides a powerful paradigm for inter-community relations, especially amongst a pluralistic or diverse group of people. Foremostly, what this vision offers is a characteristic that is inherently relational. It requires us to be committed to seeking the good of all individuals in our community, a mutually articulated and agreed upon good, which are the other groups, what we might say our covenant partners themselves articulate as their good. This goes a long way to bridging the gap of the other, because if we are in a relationship, even if it is just a contractual relationship, so to speak, it requires us to recognize the other as our legitimate partner in this venture of seeking the common good. And in a contemporary setting, I would argue it requires us to recognize them as our legitimate equal in ways that may not be required otherwise. But much more than recognize these things, it calls for us to manifest that recognition of partners and equals in action and resources. Action and resources. I'm going to come back to that. But I just want to note particularly that it's not just about seeking the good of those that are the same as us or those who are similar to us. The group that we label Israel now in the ancient text was made up of lots of different people groups, lots of different ethnicities and cultures likely, who didn't always get along. When we talk about seeking the common good, we're talking about everyone in a specific community. That includes people radically different from us, people we disagree with, people we dislike, people we hate. And I would go so far as to say people that we think are evil. When the prophets talk, they're often recalling people, those who are the poor, neglecting the poor, taking advantage of the widow and the orphan. The prophets often recall these people to the covenant precisely because they recognize that these people's misdemeanors are hurting themselves and the group as much as they are just the victims. So it's a consciousness of individual as well as communal health and good, that we can't be whole until everyone is whole. Covenant requires a serious commitment to your contractual partner. A term that's often associated with covenant is the Hebrew word chesed, which is often translated as grace or loving kindness, a lot of kind of fluffy words. Elazar has suggested that the idea translates to the legal concept of like good faith, interpreting law or treaty in favor of its members. But in the Old Testament, I believe it's something much more substantial, like loyalty to your contractual partner. But often in the examples that we have, it's explicitly a sort of sacrificial loyalty, going above and beyond what is required in the contract, because you're committed to the person, you're not committed to the law. So you can't just pay your taxes, do your due, and kind of sit back. It's a more active relationship than that. Here I'm attuned to some of Anne's other work, as well as other scholars who talk about the interplay between religious faith and political loyalty. But in this case, I don't mean so much the submission to a sovereign or an institution, so much as a group, the community, and all the individuals that make it up. I want to briefly look at the example of the relationship between the biblical figures of David and Jonathan as kind of an example of this. So the two of them make a covenant based on their friendship, and in an oath that Jonathan takes in 1 Samuel 20, verses 12 through 17, the stipulations of what that means is spelled out a little bit more. King Saul, who is Jonathan's father, is out to kill David because he recognizes that David will be the next king of Israel, and he doesn't want to be usurped. Jonathan promises to protect David, to shield him from the oppression of the current ruling government, the current monarchy. And even though he knows that David will take his place as heir to the throne. So there we get a little bit of a picture of the sacrifice that's made. In exchange, Jonathan asks that David be loyal to his house and his descendants. So we have a picture of kind of mutual political protection there. And David, in fact, follows through. Jonathan is killed in battle, and David has ascended to the throne finally. But when he is in power, he remembers his commitment to Jonathan, and he seeks out Jonathan's disabled son, Mephibosheth. He has Mephibosheth brought in to safety. He had been hiding because the kind of common practice at the time was for any sort of political rivals to be killed outright. That would have been acceptable. No one would have blamed David for that. But instead, he doesn't abuse his power in that situation. He gives Mephibosheth a place at court, a place at his table. He also provides for him materially. He gives Mephibosheth his grandfather Saul's ancestral land to farm, and he feeds him at his own table. Pledging resources, so we're back to action and resources here. Pledging material resources was a huge part of covenant commitment, especially making sure everyone eats during a famine, for example. The kind of idea was we all have a little, but we all eat because it's all shared among us. So the idea that has come up in some American conservative circles, the idea that, for example, tax is theft, or that tax shouldn't be used, it should only be used for the things that benefit me, is antithetical to the biblical concept of covenant. When you pledge yourself, you pledge your resources. You'll notice that David and Jonathan's loyalty is both active in a time of crisis and proactive in anticipating crisis. So in crisis, Jonathan shields David David brings in Jonathan's son Mephibosheth, anticipating some sort of crisis that he would fall into, both as someone who's disabled, but as someone who's on the sort of wrong end of the political spectrum in that moment. After actively seeking the other's good, in my interpretation of this, means activism and advocacy should be a regular part of our civil lives. It means going out and actively seeking whose voices aren't being heard, who can I advocate for, what's wrong that I can get involved with and help right it. Anne has talked about a little bit the sort of active participatory citizenship, and I think that's what this looks like. But it also means that we especially step up during times of crisis. I've seen that for myself among churches here in Cambridge, especially during the pandemic, creating community fridges and food banks that serve hundreds of families, but also that draw donations and volunteer support from people of all faiths and of none. So it creates a sort of rallying point around this one problem that we all agree needs to be solved. Other churches in London have cooperated with their local synagogues and mosques to create community centers as a sort of physical space materializing this goal of the common good. The appropriately named Common Good Project has talked about this sort of covenantal living as a way for churches to start thinking about not only how their local communities, local governments, etc., can be serving them, but how they can in turn be serving others. So this is already a kind of way of thinking that's catching on specifically in certain parts of the Church of England, and that I want to encourage as something that I see is, if not biblically warranted, biblically promoted and exemplified. So in summary, the vision of covenant, the vision of kind of covenant community that we see in the Old Testament offers us a vision of commitment, loyalty, activism, advocacy, resources, all towards the good of the other as part of the common good ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. And also thank you to Anne and Tobias for chairing this session. I would like to talk about the importance of the visibility of difference in public space. And I come to this with a background in political theory, history, constitutional law, as well as a bit of theology. And I use these disciplines to frame my understanding of the visibility of difference in public space around political imaginaries. Political imaginaries are concepts, metaphors, or ideas that a society might allude to in order to assert a specific identity, norms, or perhaps values. In my work, I look at France, Germany, and the Netherlands in their early modern as well as contemporary appearances. And I do that because the political imaginaries of these periods and contexts are actually quite different, but also sounding quite similar in some ways. And this bears on how comfortable a society might be with the visibility of others in public space. In early modern Europe, the guiding imaginary is that of the Corpus Christianum. This translates to the body of Christ in English, which is always emphasized to be united or one amidst its diversity. Politically, it is often the oneness that is foregrounded and which underpins a normative interconnection between land, people, and purpose. And in the connection of early modern Christendom, this connection is deeply entwined with Christian culture and politics. What stands out is that the presence of others is regulated through mechanisms of toleration, which, as long as other identities are in fact tolerated, conditions their visibility in public space. For example, tolerated minorities might be able to worship in private, not usually in public. When the normative religion has festivals to celebrate, these minorities still have to close their shops. They might need to bury their dead outside of designated spaces and do so quietly, and they cannot hold unlicensed processions unless they have specific permission. Or they might have lesser economic rights, or in fact be unable to obtain full citizenship right whatsoever. Now, there are, of course, a lot of different practices, nuances, locally in particular, that reflect greater tolerance as well as lesser tolerance. And it's really impossible to distinguish one linear development from, for example, toleration to religious freedom. However, what is important is that the limitation of the visibility of otherness upholds the imaginary of oneness. Outward conformity is necessary to sustain this normative identity, and the non-conformity of these others would trigger economic, physical, and religious violence. This matters from a theoretical perspective, because though these minorities might be incorporated, they are marginalized. In a constitutional order, the assumption that lawyers and many others tend to make is that religious violence has been resolved and that over time, the identity of the nation or the nation state would take precedent over sectarian identities. This does not imply that national identity exists at odds with religious identity. In fact, emerging nation states were still culturally very much Christian, even if diversely so. However, we do see that religious identities can be othered, both when nation states were in their formative stages, but also in contemporary societies. Perhaps this is most obvious with France's Muslims and the regulations on women's clothing, like the hijab, the jilbab, and the niqab. But the story is much more complicated than that. French political discourse very much hides behind concepts of secularity, the legal notion of living together, which featured in the SAS case that Zachary Kalo mentioned yesterday, as well as the values of the French Republic. Muslim identity is often framed as diametrically opposed to French identity. And note that the normative oneness of land, people, and purpose resurfaces at exactly this point. Muslims are seen often as foreign, un-French, and their religion would threaten democratic values. If you'd like to read more about how the normative interconnection of land, people, and purpose relates to both the corpus Christianum of early modernity and the nation state, then I refer you to my thesis, Politics of Religious Diversity, a link of which should be in the chat. What is important to note, however, is that the concept of secularity is also leveraged against conservative religion in some countries. And it is no surprise that some of the conservative, but also Jewish communities, Christian, but also Jewish communities, experience a change in what it means to participate in society. And what we see across the board is, of course, a distrust that Anne speaks of, but also perhaps an inability to make sense of a position that cannot be understood as merely majoritarian or minoritarian. And this makes sense, particularly because religious communities some of them have always existed as minorities, both in early modernity as well as in the nation state. And we often forget that secularization is very much a reaction to majoritarian religion. It is vital for us to make such distinctions. And I think it also helps us to understand why some religious communities revert to postures that we might associate with what it means to be a minority. In this context, we see that visibility is again important. We're not just talking about Muslim attire. We are also talking about the display of crosses, the space that there might be to express religious ideas in public, sometimes in politics specifically. But I still do not think that that is where most of the pain is in some of these Christian communities. I think it has a lot to do with the normativity of values that may be experienced as contrary to certain religious beliefs and practices. And in this sense, I think it is not so much that religious expressions are made invisible. In fact, they often aren't, though they may be. It is also the colloquial lament of wider culture that is perceived to push Christian identity out. That has no space for it, perhaps. And when Christian communities engage these discourses, it is incredibly important to emphasize that they still have tremendous freedoms, that those freedoms are not always trumped in politics or indeed in case law, and that therefore we must be very careful with entertaining the language of being persecuted, for example, as you sometimes hear. This language is plainly unwarranted, historically insufficiently informed, and I would say contributes to a dialectic of us versus them, which is undermining of the very societal structures here in Europe. Where this happens in particular is where the language of counterculturality is misconstrued to refer to these conflicts in society. In fact, it is entirely normal for societies to wrestle through questions of coexistence, and actually on an ongoing basis. It is entirely normal for other people to say that they don't like what somebody believes or what somebody does. And this does not mean that Christianity as such is threatened. And it is important that Christian identity does not get constructed over against wider society, or worse, leveraged by right-wing populists for wildly different political purposes. A Christian identity that is constructed over against others, or at least colloquially so, is empty and exists in a vacuum. At the risk of sounding like an evangelical preacher, I'd say the good news is, however, that the language of toleration as such, as well as the dialectic of minorities and majorities, is largely out of space. And of course, Christian communities are free to adopt a language of counterculturality from across the Atlantic. But I think it's vital for the future of Christianity on the continent that these communities develop new ways of engaging. This requires homework, but it will be rewarding. I think this involves a recognition of the historical impact of Christianity on secular culture, the ongoing freedoms that are in fact being enjoyed, as well as the importance of protecting the freedoms of other religious communities, including Jewish, Islamic, and other religious communities. To conclude, the priority of Christian communities, I think, should not rest with the ad hoc assertion of particular religious symbols, beliefs, or practices. I think Christian communities need to do some homework on the meaning of being present, perhaps like the Emmanuel, the figure of Christ, like that this was present, and took pleasure in being with those who are regarded as not quite good enough or fallen away. And this presence might need something of the vulnerability that Anne has spoken of, and which in Anglican circles very much features in the writings of Rowan Williams. Perhaps even a willingness to be pushed out on occasion might be on the cards, but it doesn't mean it's defeated. Instead, a more humble presence might facilitate an understanding of social participation in which oneness derives from the cultural transcendences of the many. Or back to the common good, where the common good derives from the cultural transcendences of the many, even if this means learning to be more comfortable with contradiction and complexity. Christian communities, of course, have a legitimate space in society and have a legitimate place to contribute layers of meaning to the common good. And I think these communities would do well in shedding some of the North American postures, which really derive from non-conformist backgrounds, and instead recover some of the more positive attitudes towards society, culture, and politics, which has a credible tradition of its own here in Europe. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Marietta. Thank you, Sophia, and thank you, Anne. I think that's really a round of applause, and I think really fantastic starting of the conversation. We already have the first couple of questions in, but to everybody, do feel free to put yours in as well, as we are going to start discussing. I have a couple of questions on my own, but I probably leave them for a later point, because I think we have a few questions that center around a similar problematic that a few of you have brought up, and that is in a way the question of how to keep Christianity as a distinctive contribution and also critic in society, and as a contributor to the common good, while also not wanting to be hegemonic. So just taking here a question from Jonathan Chaplin that was initially directed to Anne, but I think really also relates to what Sophia and Marietta have said, and in a way asking the question whether there are many examples here in particular in France of religious citizens or organizations who propose pointed religious critiques of modern secular republicanism. So bringing in this specifically Christian perspective, but who do not display the negative trends of what you could call Christian identity politics. So in a way, how keeping this balance between being distinctive and also not wanting to be hegemonic, but at the same time being critical. Yes. So should we start off with Anne? Do you want to start off responding to that, and then we can maybe go through?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Jonathan, for your question. It allows me to get into more details of the Catholic landscape and give you maybe a more nuanced picture than the one I gave during my presentation. Actually, we can, like what we call the cathosphere, we can distinguish 4 types. So it's 4 types that I'm proposing because religious sociologists would share other types of other categories that are more complex. But just to make it clear, I would say that there one category that we can call the identity Catholics, and I talked about them during my presentation, and which are really related to the far right parties. And then you have the conservative or new conservative Catholic. They are more and more acquainted to the identity Catholics, but they are more traditionally on the Republican electorate as a sens commun, and their desire is an articulation between economic freedom, social solidarity, and societal conservatism, but they are not defending the identity of the. They have a speech about nation, but they are not as harsh and racialist as the one in the identity Catholics. And then we have a third category that is a young generation in between right and left, so to say, and they just appeared a few years ago, and they are caught between the economic liberalism of the right and the cultural liberalism of the left. So I see in this third category an attempt to decompartmentalize this traditional distinction between the right and the left in France in order to create an intellectual and political space where these two anti-liberalism could be articulated. So there have been like the creation of a review in 2015 called Limits, and they're all, I think, between 25 and 40 years old. They are helped by publishing house, a famous one in France, Les Éditions du Cerf, which are related to the Dominican. And this journal is called Revue d'écologie intégrale, and it's built on the insight of the encyclical Laudato Si from the Pope Francis, and they are clearly critiques of economical liberalism and so capitalism, but they are also conveying a very conservative moral on sexual rights and gender equality. There are also been the creation of coffee shops, the same generation, the early 30s. There is one in Lyon that is called Le Simone, and the other in Paris called the Dorothy. So Simone is for Simone Weil, the French philosopher, and the Dorothy is for Dorothy Day, so this American Catholic, and I think she was clearly like claimed Marxist Catholic in New York. So they criticize the identity Christian or Catholics, and that they criticize the fact that Catholicism tends to be reduced to the bourgeois and the upper middle classes in France. And they were like the only one who were saying that the church has missed out on the Gilets jaunes phenomenon in 2018 and 2019, when we had a big demonstration in France after the reform of the retreat. I don't remember the word in English.
Retirement.
Retirement, thank you. Reform. So, and the last the last category is left-wing Christians, but they are very zeldom. They were very popular in the 60s and the 70s, and historically, left-wing Catholicism is always born on the right, so to say, and these are activists whose faith moves them to the left because they can no longer stand the complicity of right-wing circles with the established order. So it is often economic anti-liberalism that makes them break away. And but there are few nowadays, and they are, at least in France, they are unable to. They don't have the same power of building a collective power as the right-wing Christian or Catholics were able to do during the Manif pour tous, and then to found political movement and journals. There have been like a lot of journals that has been created after the Manif pour tous and the coffee shops and so on.
Yeah, maybe Marietta or Sophia, if you want to follow up on that, maybe expanding beyond the French context as well, and looking for some examples of movements in that direction, either in the other European or also like beyond the Western world, perhaps would be interesting to think about.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a very good question that Jonathan has brought up, because if anything, some of this discourse on counterculturality and masculinity in particular is, of course, slightly overpublished in North America to start with, but it's also increasingly being picked up across Europe, certainly not limited to the French case. I think the Netherlands saw some wave of political outrage over the translation of a Nashville statement in Dutch, which was clunky to start with, but also really failed to address the needs of the Dutch society. It was just a shortcut import of concerns that really weren't so Dutch. I think what is important to see is that some of these networks are strong transnational networks, and that perhaps is one of the reasons why some of these more conservative negative voices are the voices that we hear. However, I think it is very important to recognize and acknowledge that Christian spaces are much more diverse than just these voices. And also, when it comes to events like this or other events, it's really important to give a platform to such voices and actually to demonstrate that there is very thoughtful and constructive engagement to be found in these Christian spaces, as long as we're willing to look for it. I think that's all I say at this point. I'll hand over to you, Tobias.
Yeah, just wanted to see whether, Sophia, you seem to have some contribution to that as well, and then we move on to the next block of questions.
Yeah, I mentioned briefly in my response the kind of prophetic tradition critiquing in a very kind of social justice thrust those who take advantage of the marginalized, who, for example, like could take way too much interest on loans to the poor that they know they can't take back, or who claim some of the property of widows and orphans in order to have some sort of compensation or something like that. And the prophets specifically are calling these people out. So the idea of a Christian critique goes all the way back to the Bible. It naturally is kind of a part of the multitude of voices. But also, I think I want to reiterate and mention Dorothy Day, but also among the different, as much as we have in France, in Anne's presentation, all of these negative examples of Catholic public engagement, so to speak, we also have so many orders and traditions from the Catholic Church, particularly like the Poor Clares and the Jesuits, and different people who have throughout the ages been some of the most active public voices in calling for things like equal education, especially of the poor, of slaves, of people of color, especially in kind of Catholic colonies and all those sorts of things. That doesn't mean that they didn't have other problematic engagements with the politics of their time, but that it has been a huge part of the history of public engagement. And they saw themselves as standing in the same tradition as those prophets. So the kind of active prophetic critique, I think, finds its place very naturally in Christian public and political engagement. And I hope that it continues to be that way, with this kind of view of having, being a voice for those who are otherwise voiceless, even if they aren't Christian, so to speak.
No, fantastic. And I think there's really a lot of thought on that. And maybe in a way, building on that and going a step further, we had a couple of questions that also bring in, so to speak, what are the limits and confines of either the covenant or the common good? How do we actually define that? And in particular, we have questions, for instance, from Marca Valenta about the role of the nation state, the crisis of the nation state, and specifically to what extent the conservative reactions, conservative Christian reactions, are really primarily reactions to the crisis of the nation state, or they're also drivers of the crisis of the nation state, and what would be a political or a religiously progressive approach to that, and then also bringing in questions like those of Joanildo Bariti. How do we define the common good? How do we define this in a way almost pre-political community of who belongs to the covenant? So maybe Sophia, if you want to start on that, and then maybe Marietta and Anne could add their perspectives.
Absolutely, yeah. I think the kind of conservative lashback to the crisis of the nation state is entirely natural, in part because the idea of covenant is so grounded in the idea of constitution and nation in so many Western countries, especially those that have had strong Protestant influence over the course of their history. So, for example, especially in America, we have so much of the kind of religious right, so to speak, who are calling back to, oh, we were founded as a Christian nation, you know, the Constitution is our holy covenant. All of this like very biblical language, which is casting the nation. This has happened at different points throughout history, casting the nation as the kind of new Israel, as this kind of holy nation, and all of those sorts of things. So it makes sense that when the nation, so to speak, or the Constitution or whatever it is that we find to represent that, comes under critique, or as they may feel under fire, that they might feel that some of the religious tradition that goes with that is also under fire. I think in response to Joanildo's comment just a little bit more briefly, I think that when it comes to using covenant not at that national level, which, as you can tell just from the kind of reiteration of holy nation, it comes with so many problems of exclusion of religious groups and all sorts of things. But looking at it at a local level, I think that we really need to define what that local level is, what that community is, and not just talk about kind of one big covenant, one big nation. We might even say one big like county or something, but that it needs to be a kind of mutually discussed, mutually agreed upon common good, in a sense, that the other, when Christians are sat at the table with other groups, are able to articulate their vision of the good for themselves, that it's not something that's necessarily thrust upon them. So I do think that that's really important. And we find, for example, I mentioned David and Jonathan's covenant, but David had covenants with Abner, Saul's head of command, with the elders of Israel. So we see this kind of plurality in different contexts, where you might have different kind of visions of what that common good is, constantly being adapted and redefined as that good changes, as that vision changes. So it definitely is something that we need to be willing to work with other people on, but also be willing to revisit in order for it to stay applicable.
No, fantastic. Marietta, Anne, do you have an immediate response from your perspective?
I think I do. Yeah. I really like the perspective of Covenant in this regard, because I think it's often an overlooked discipline, biblical scholarship in political theory. But I would also like to make some comments that might maybe steer us in a slightly different direction in thinking of how Covenant might relate to these communities, and particularly because, you know, the question of like, is there a free political community? Well, of course there isn't. Any community is political by definition. And I think it's really important to see that the formation of nation state was a formation of political entities out of pre-existing communities that were not unusually ripped apart and recrafted together. And we see this, for example, in the secession of Belgium from the Netherlands in 1830. We see this in Hungary, where there is a lot of anger still in the community over parts of land and ethnic minorities that have been assigned to different countries, and there might be good reasons for that, but nevertheless, that has caused a lot of anger still to today. And I think it's just important to notice that communities are always in flux, but by definition also what the common good is always in flux, and whether or not we agree on this having to change really isn't relevant. It is always changing. The question is, how do we relate to it? And I think it is in the very concrete things when it comes to particular political questions that we can talk about agreement and some level of voluntarism. But of course, politics of power, there is a lot of coercion involved. And even, you know, the democracies that we praise for being historically so are democracies that weren't really established by popular consent. They were just established by elites who were happening to be ruling. And I think this is something that we cannot lose sight of, especially as, you know, it was really in the course of the 20th century that suffrage became actually general for men, for women. But mind you, for colonized peoples, this was after the Second World War. And even to today, there are really nuances and limitations to the suffrage of some of the historically colonized people in relation to connections that might still exist with so-called mother countries. So I think there are all these complexities that we need to take into account, but it really show that you know, the common good is complex, it's always in flux, and the question is really how do we relate to it?
And also just a quick note on the side, if people have direct responses or questions if to one of the panelists' responses, for instance, put it in the Q&A. If I see it immediately, I will then try to bring that in directly. But yeah, Anne, you I think you had something to contribute to this as well, didn't you?
Yes, thank you, Tobias. Yeah, I would say that this shift to the far right from the Christian and especially the Catholic in France is a reaction to the crisis of nation states, and it accentuates the crisis by the action and the speeches that they are conveying. So I believe that, for example, the issue of migrants is one of the most polarizing subjects and divide Catholicism as a whole in France. So behind it lies the relationship to the authority of the Pope and the hierarchy between belonging to the church and to the nation. So we see that there is consequently a right wing of observers, which for example, one journalist called Laurent Dandrieux illustrates very well, which can be described as a neo-Gallican, that is to say, which wants to assert a certain autonomy of the national church in relation to the papacy. So he's really against the welcoming of migrants, and he calls this a suicide. And on the other hand, there is a new form of ultramontanism, with the blogger, which is Cause Toujours, and his real name is Erwan Lemoredec, for example, and he denounces the nationalist instrumentalization of the faith. And this issue of migrants polarizes Catholicism and generates new currents. But I think there is a paradox in France, which can be found in many European societies, and populist or right-wing parties are increasingly mobilizing the reference to Christian roots in their discourse. And these Christian roots are used as a cultural boundary in order to essentialize the belonging to the nation. So the instrumentalization makes it possible to assert that Muslims will never be French or Europeans like the others. And this reference to Christian roots is not really, for me at least, a return to religion. On the contrary, it marks a further stage in secularization, because religious symbolism becomes a pure instrument of identity and is therefore totally subordinated to political rationality. So, yeah, and so I would make I would suggest that a progressive, if it's the word, political theology would underline the distinction between the identity, the nation identity, and the belonging to a political community that can recognize the plurality of this community. So that would be my answer.
And maybe actually following up on that very briefly, I'd be intrigued in your view on whether in some ways, if you look at the populist right, especially in Western Europe, that they actually are in very secular societies increasingly defining the nation on the one hand, yes, in Christian roots, but also very specifically in secular ways of saying we are also defined by the separation of church and state, by laïcité, or even the Front National running around and saying we are the real defenders of gay and women rights. Whether in some ways, especially they're almost doing a service to conservative Christians by showing them that the nation is not necessarily conservative Christian by definition, that actually they might be turning away from that in a way. I'd just be intrigued how you see these dynamics of right-wing populists really combining these different references to, on the one hand, secular or even liberal values, and then on the other hand, the Christian roots.
I'm sorry, Tobias, I'm not sure I understood your question.
Okay. No, I was just following up on that because I'd be intrigued on your view, because we do see in many Western societies that right-wing populists not only talk about Christian roots of countries and Christian identity in the way you described it, often secular ways, but they combine that. For instance, in France, the Front National say we are the real defenders of secularism and laïcité, and whether that might not even be in some ways positive if you think about, or not positive, but like for conservative Christians, a way to show them that actually France isn't necessarily Catholic, and kind of helps breaking apart the idea of the covenant just being a national concept.
So if I understood well,
no, I mean otherwise it's too confusing.
It's just what I understood is you asked if the ambiguity of the far right party in France between having this mobilizing the speeches about Christian roots, and in the same way saying that they are supporting secularism in France and so on, and how. Yeah. But your question is, how does it impact the Catholic electorate? That this ambiguity, is it your question, or yeah?
Yeah, to an extent, like asking for instance, the people who go to the Manif pour tous, these very conservative Catholics that might in fact have thought the Front National is on our side, but then actually realizing, oh, this nationalism, as you say, is actually quite secular.
Yeah, well, actually, I think like during the election in 2017, it was more than 1/3 of practicing Catholic that voted for Le Pen, which was really so not surprising, but astonishing. But it's political sociologists said, like, actually these Catholics say that they were not supporting the Front National program, but it was a vote by default because they didn't want to support Emmanuel Macron, as he wasn't defending the anthropological understanding, like the Christian anthropological understanding, and that's why they preferred to vote for Marine Le Pen, even if they were not agreeing about a lot of her program. So I don't think they are stupid, or they are. I think they're quite aware of the ambiguity of the discourse, but it is more a vote by default because they prefer this than to have the promotion of cultural rights being supported by the left or the central left in France.
Very good. And Marietta, we have a quick follow-up for you as well from Marka, who is asking that regarding that all communities are by definition political, whether you could perhaps say something more about that regarding the body of Christ, when St. Paul says we are all in one Christ. Is this from that very first moment a political statement, or does it only become that later?
I think that's a very good question, but I also think that really goes into kind of the reception history of the writings of St. Paul. That's not something I'm necessarily an expert on, but what I can say is that the notion of the Corpus Christianum was primarily a theological notion in the medieval period, and which really, through the encounter with early modernity, as it were, became translated in a political concept of toleration, which before had been mostly theological. There are some authors who have written about this. I don't have them on the top of my mind, but Marka, since I have your email address, I will get back to you on that one. But it's a very interesting question for sure. I think what is really important to see is that the oneness that is associated with toleration and the body of Christ is one that really resurfaces in a nation state, as I think you pointed out in one of your other questions, and that the ramifications of that should not be underestimated for the purposes of understanding diversity and regulating diversity in contemporary societies.
I think if I can speak to that just a little bit, I am less familiar with the reception history of the New Testament, so I may have a little bit more limited knowledge, but in kind of reading more broadly on biblical reception history and Christian political thought, something that does come up a bit in relation to the Christ, we are all one in Christ, and there is no Jew or Greek, there is no slave or free kind of language. Which I think comes up, it first came up in the Reformation, when especially the kind of the area where Luther was preaching, and the kind of lords who were trying to play different groups against each other, especially along lines of perhaps we might say ethnicity, but more along kind of traditional family lines. Or particular brands of a certain kind of Christianity, were trying to play against each other. So Luther really tried to use that language to overcome those boundaries, and to say, like, well, you know, we all need to band together. But he had a very, very kind of narrow definition of what that meant. And it was we all come together to kind of be against this kind of oppression, so it wasn't more general. More recently, we have seen that kind of language, we are all one in Christ, used, I think, quite dangerously when addressing things like race, for example, or socioeconomic division, to say like, what, and this came up a little bit in the panel yesterday when someone brought up the multiplicity of identities and kind of like, oh, well, I'm not just Black, I'm also, etc. I'm not just a woman, I'm also, but this kind of painting over and saying, but all of those other labels don't matter. We are all the same. We are all Christians, tends to gloss over the different kinds of experiences and hardships that are faced by different groups, even within the Christian church. So you can imagine then what kind of problems come out of that view when we also look outside of the Christian church. So there have been some we could say positive and negative uses of that kind of language throughout history, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting also question, of course. I know whether Marietta and Anne would want to add to that, like how you balance, on the one hand, the contribution of Christianity as the idea of universalism, but then really without trying to like cover up distinctions that are there for a good reason, or that you might want to emphasize because they bring diversity and richness, and what a Christian contribution to that can be, in particular if we think about also, for instance, Catholic theology that is trying to balance that for millennia between, on the one hand, the Church Universal and then also quite national churches. I don't know whether you have any immediate responses to that.
I'm happy to comment a little bit. I think what is so important is that when we look at Christian engagement, that yes, there is to some extent a universalist narrative, but really when we talk about hardship, and really the flip side of that is justice, we are not finding that in the grand narratives. We are not finding that in great concepts. We're finding that in very specific moments and specific decisions and specific commitments to other people in our society. And I think that is where politics is very different from theology. Politics is a constant give and take. It is looking for changing and differing majorities to pursue certain democratic sanctioning, as it were, of certain ideas. But I think what is important is that we avoid going into the take what is not due to you because you have a certain worldview. And I think this really comes up when it comes to gender and sexuality. And I know when people start talking about that, it's very easy to portray somebody as, oh, that is leftist. But I think what I'm saying here is of constitutional importance, and comes back to Sophia's comment about protecting each other and protecting each other's interests. That, for example, when we talk about the protection of women and about the protection of LGBTQ plus communities, what is really important is that there is a protection of economic status, there is a protection of political status, there is a protection of social status. And religious communities can make of that what they want, but politically what matters is that people need a certain protection. And I hope that that is not something that people necessarily need to disagree on. I think that is a highly political disagreement if it exists, and really kind of glosses over the very kind of basic point that protection is due to the other, even if you might think what they define as good for them might not be good for them in your opinion. I think that is really of secondary importance politically. And, you know, there are, of course, people who think very differently about this in Christian communities. Some are very happy to support gay causes, but there's also voices, and again, loud voices that like to portray these interests as existing in opposition to a Christian narrative. And, you know, I cannot really enter into a critique of either of those, but I think what I would like to say is constitutionally, you're obliged each other the basic protection of life, liberty, property, as if we go back all the way to John Locke. You might disagree, might be in different churches, but it shouldn't impact on your social, economic and political status. And I think it's just important to underline that, especially in the light of what Sophia has been talking about in the context of covenant.
Yeah. No, fantastic. And do you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think for this question, the tension between universalism of Christianism and the singularity of nation state, I would say it's really the question of how you define universalism and Christian universalism, and if it's something that comes from above and has a very narrow definition and imposing to the rest of the world. Of course, it might be the problem that one state nation will have the right definition of universalism and impose it for the other nation state. But I think that what's liberal thought, I don't know if it's liberal thought that brought that or Christian universalism, but I think that the idea of, I think it's the French philosopher Merleau-Ponty, who said that there is a kind of lateral universalism that comes from the gathering of singular experiences, and pluralism is actually the idea of by sharing our specific experiences, we can create something common. And this is a better way to understand universalism, because it does not come from above and impose one vision to the others. So it can be expressed in an example. For the Catholic Church, for example, last year there were it's not an encyclical, but it's an I don't remember the specific name, but they did what's the name of it? A gathering of all bishops and cardinals for Amazonia, and it's called Querida Amazonia, and they were talking about the possibility to open to lay people and maybe to women the possibility of giving the Eucharisty, so like act as priests, because in Amazonia there are so few priests, then people can wait 1 year before having a mass with the Eucharist. So the question raised then was, is it possible to make an exception in some parts of the world where the lack of priests would allow lay people to act as priests and without having the sacraments. So this is a good example, I think, of how this and it was really a shame, I think, from my point of view, that they forbade the possibility that lay people were able to give the communion, because it would have made a distinction within the canonic law. So they forbade it, and I think it's really a pity that they done that, because it's again imposing one way of seeing what should be a lay person, what should be a priest, and imposing it all over the world without taking into consideration the specificity of every culture and state nations.
Yeah, no, I think this is really fascinating, and maybe now moving a step onwards to another couple of questions, and that is basically taking this from this quite abstract and theoretical and theological level, maybe to a very specific and concrete way of how, so we have a couple of questions of how faith communities on the ground and churches on the ground are supposed to address some of these issues. So, for instance, we have Jim Robertson, who is asking that a lot of people of faith in the public sphere, whether they be politicians working for banks, et cetera, are making decisions that are against the common good. How to address such individual behavior in churches, but it would obviously also be interesting to ask you how, for instance, the 6 principles that you laid out, on how you think that these would be best communicated or put into practice in local faith communities without then falling into the trap of prescribing to people how to live their faith. So if you want to start with that, Anne, and then we maybe go to Sophia and Marietta.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it would be already a good thing if, because so to come back to the case of France, when there were the Manif pour tous in 2013, every Sunday in the church, when I went to the mass, I heard during the priest making his preach about inviting people to go to the Manif pour tous, and they were always making a very political preach, but it was really focused on this topic related to cultural rights. But I never heard any priest saying during a mass that the decision that Michelin or I don't know, or Total or any multinational decision would have would go against the common good. And so there is a kind of prioritizing politics that is clear within the church in France. And of course, in any case, even if it's to say that actually the most problematic topic today, it's the ecological collapse, for example. I would never hear this from a priest or a bishop in France, but in any case, no one wants to be told what we should do as a chief executive in an enterprise, because I'm Christian, so I'm supposed to act like this or like this. But I think it might be interesting, at least to, as I think you propose, to have groups within the church where people can talk about these questions and to really have the possibility to make these discernments together in small groups without being directed by the social doctrine of the church or the priest that wants to lead the conversation in one direction and not giving space to have a real debate on those topics. That's, I think, is very needed. But the thing is that practicing Catholics are very few. So I don't know if maybe it must be done in other spaces than only in the churches. And I think what I said earlier about the creation of those coffee shops in 2 big cities in France is a small witness that something is a bit changing on the space where those debates can be made, I think.
Yes, Sophia, Marietta, do you want to build on that and talk about who wants to go first? I see both of you nodding. Sophia, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. I absolutely think that it's important that churches are talking about it, not only as Anne discussed, kind of from the pulpit, but among church members, but also having churches in general be vocal about these, issues that they see in the community. I think that, as I kind of said in my initial response, I think that that kind of active engagement is something that we're called to, that is sorely lacking in what we see in churches today. But also because different churches will have different issues that are close to their heart, that are important to them. I think it's really important that we have, lots of churches that are speaking up about lots of different issues to kind of also be able to reflect the diversity, not only like within the Christian body, but the diversity of problems and obstacles that face different aspects of the community. So I used to be involved in a church back in the States in California that was really, really concerned about prison reform, because they had a ministry that was in service to often educating inmates and felons who were in prison for various amounts of times. And they saw different abuses or different problems with the system. And that was a particular kind of corner of the community that may not have been seen, or its problems wouldn't have been voiced otherwise without that kind of engagement. And there will be other churches that are involved in their own ministries because of their own members, or because of the kind of neighborhood that they're in, for example, will have different concerns, and having all of those concerns voiced and acted upon, I think creates such a much more holistic kind of picture of what we're looking at, not only kind of in their own communities, but also as kind of a local community. If, like in Cambridge, there are so many churches, if they could all pick their own little issue, but I'm sure this is the same throughout much of Europe and the States, where churches are many and varied, but also just faith communities in general. Yeah, would love to see more of that.
Marietta, do you want to come in on that as well?
Please. I think, one of the responses to secularization for many religious communities has been to turn inward. And one expression could be the countercultural expression that we spoke about, where the church is pitted against, or religious community is pitted against, wider society. And mind you, this is not limited to Christian communities. This happens in conservative Muslim communities as well. I think the other response that we see is an emphasis on personal holiness or personal blamelessness. And I think whilst this is an understandable response that I think sits together kind of with the private move that Anne spoke about, but also fits the minority posture of toleration, where your worship happens in private, I think that really hinders some of this proactive engagement. And I think part of addressing these issues when it is, for example, something that goes against the common good, might be just a recognition that life is messy, the world is messy, and some of the theological constructs that we have for understanding good and evil don't really map onto the world as people experience it. And I think, that is one dimension, but the other dimension is also a willingness to make dirty hands, as it were, because you are part of a larger story. However, there is also something to be said for speaking out against abuses that happen in a community and within both within the church and outside of the church, in for example in banks, as I think Jim is referring to. I think it is really important that there is a courage for that to happen, but I also think that it is almost a mistake to say that happens only outside of the church. It is as important for people to speak out inside. I think the other dimension to this is where people perceive that their actions might go against their faith and therefore against the common good that they articulate for themselves to be. And I would really come back to what Sophia was saying about embracing the whole of it, also when you don't agree, also when something that might be good for somebody else might not be so good for you, as perhaps part of an attitude, of a posture. But I imagine, for example, when working in the civil service, that also comes down to a certain level of professionalism and knowing where the boundaries are between your personal responsibility and where your personal responsibility does end, because there is that dynamic as well. Of course, I don't know what issues Jim has in mind specifically, and I might not be speaking to those in particular. I'm only responding to the question as I see it. So it might be woefully inadequate what I've just said, but I think that would be my 2 cents on this.
No, I think, and this is Jim's opportunity. If any of you, or we address your questions, as I say, have follow-up questions, do feel free to post them in the Q&A section. This is probably your last opportunity as we are slowly moving towards the end of the time we have allocated for this. So do feel free. But I think, oh, Jim is actually, no, never mind. But one of the things that I think comes out here quite a bit is really the question of how to balance belief and belonging in many ways, and like having these churches creating a sense of community, of belonging together, but also focusing on individual belief. And I'd just be really interested in your view, because there's obviously an awful lot of literature at the moment coming out that is actually saying a lot of the right-wing populist reactions we see at the moment is also a response to the erosion of social structures, the erosion of collective forms of identity, including the erosion of traditional forms of religious belonging, not necessarily just belief, but just religious belonging, that you felt this is somewhat part of, and this forms our community. And then the big question is, how can churches respond? Because on the one hand, this is an involvement that might be seen as positive because it gives much greater individual freedom. It gives much more space for individual expression. It takes a lot of constraints away. But on the other hand, it does leave a lot of communities or former communities feeling isolated, and then they look for other sources of group identity, such as nationalism. So I'd just be intrigued how you think faith communities can really strike this balance between allowing for individualism, allowing for belief, but also creating strong communities, because the problem is, psychologically speaking, strong communities often are all the more stronger, the more demanding they are in many respects. So I'd be intrigued to your responses to that. And maybe use this also if you want to bring something else, as we are running out of time. So if there are points that you really want to make and give people to ponder about, this is your opportunity. So should we just go the other way around and start with Marietta and then have Sophia and then Anne?
Sure. Thank you. I'm still re-articulating your question in my mind.
Yeah.
I think what I would say is the erosion of social structures is, I think, more a transformation of society rather than just an erosion. And I think, societies have always changed, they've always been changing. And this is just one next chapter where I think many churches see that perhaps, and I think this goes for religious communities in general, their identities as attached to an institution are really the dimension of faith that might be eroding. But at the same time, there is an emerging focus on networks and on the building of really kind of connections that might not be based necessarily locally or institutionally, but that are much more scattered and flexible. And I think this is not just a threat, it is also an opportunity to rethink kind of the structures in which the church can choose to operate. And I think particularly in the local context where this is relevant is the cooperation that both Anne and Sophia have been talking about, where, you know, depending on your ecclesiology, I suppose, the parish may or may not involve actually everyone who isn't necessarily in a church as such. But just that as my final thought, really kind of religion as networks rather than institutions, not just as a threat, but also as a possibility for rethinking some social engagement.
Sophia.
Yeah, so Marietta talked about networks. I think one of the things that I want to talk about is coming together to kind of form these commonalities over the sorts of obstacles and common crises or tragedies themselves. So I mentioned briefly in my response how there were certain churches in London that were coming together to create these kind of common community spaces with other mosques and synagogues in their area. And primarily that has come about in the pandemic because lots of these communities wanted a common place to mourn the loss of life, to mourn the loss of community, of social interaction, and all of these sorts of things. There's I can't remember her name, but there's a mayor in Southern California of a town called Fullerton, who I've been able to meet, and she comes from a very conservative Christian background. She was originally just like a housekeeping mom, stay-at-home mom, but she was just so frustrated how her local government wasn't addressing issues of homelessness, like overwhelming homelessness. And so she ran for mayor and got elected primarily because she was willing to work across the aisle, so to speak, with Democrats and people who had radically different political ideas to her, but because they both commonly mourned this idea that there were people sleeping on the street when it seemed like such a not necessarily an easy problem to solve, but one that had very tangible solutions to it. And so I really think I don't want to say a utopian vision of community, but at least the sense of value of community and of good quality of life for those around us might be more bonding than we otherwise would be willing to give it merit for. I mean, we think about in workplaces, people make friends with their coworkers, even though they might have never been friends outside of that context. So I think having that kind of commonality, especially when it's something that we can act upon together, that we can take concrete steps in partnership together, hopefully provides some of what that, common identity that we feel is lost is taken away.
Fantastic. Anne, you have the last word.
Thank you. I think I would just underline what Sarah just said, because I think the most productive way is to, as I said at the end of my presentation, is to cooperate with non-believer or other believer in really concrete actions and finding fights and common ground where we can act together. So I think that's it brings trust in others, and it brings solidarity. So I think it's the most important way of dealing with the problematic we were talking about.
No, thank you so much, all three of you. We are at an end time-wise, and I think we've covered, and we could keep on talking forever, but I think we covered an awful lot of ground, ranging from very abstract theology and political theory to very much on the ground, how to deal with many of these things, unpacking concepts from covenant theology to identity politics and right-wing populism. But as I say, we are running out of time, but the conversation does go on. So just a couple of last notices, because we are actually going to have this in-person hybrid Protestant Political Thought Conference that we are planning for April next year. So if any of you wants to contribute and come into this conversation, please do get in touch. We are also planning a workshop series with the Protestant Political Thought Project and the DAAD between 2021 and 23. So again, keep your eyes open, do get involved in that. And then finally, you don't have to wait all the time to the conference, because we do have already next week our next webinar. So the Alfred Landecker program is hosting now monthly seminars on religion, populism, and democracy. And our next seminar will be on the 20th of April about what's white, about white Christian nationalism, race, religion, and war in the making of America, where we will have Phil Horsky talking from Yale, and then a response from Jeffrey Haynes based on his new book. So do join us for that, and do join us for all the other things. The conversation goes on. And again, thank you so much to all of our panelists. Very good.